when kindness changes everything. For 5 years, Marcus Reed stood behind the checkout counter at the small corner store called Oakwood Market, located in the heart of an old, tight-knit neighborhood in Atlanta. Every day, from early morning until well after sundown, Marcus worked his shift with patience, courtesy, and a quiet pride that went unnoticed by most who passed through the glass doors of the store. He was 29 years old. He had dark, thoughtful eyes that rarely missed a detail and the kind of quiet voice that made people lean in to listen. Life had not been easy for Marcus. His paycheck barely covered rent and utilities, and he often skipped meals to make sure his younger sister, Sierra, had everything she needed to finish college. But Marcus believed in one thing above all else: doing the right thing, whether anyone was watching or not. And that belief, on an ordinary evening in October, was about to change his life. A familiar face in an unfamiliar place. It was a chilly Friday evening, and the streets of Atlanta thrummed with life. Traffic clogged the intersections, the glow of neon signs reflected off the wet pavement, and horns blared impatiently as pedestrians wove between cars with practiced ease. But several blocks away, tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop, Oakwood Market stood quietly. Its flickering neon sign hummed above the door, casting a soft green glow that pooled beneath it like a small island in the dark. Inside, the store smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. The shelves were narrow and crowded, stocked with everything from canned goods and bread to batteries and detergent. The walls were lined with flyers advertising job postings and lost pets. It wasn't much, but it was home for Marcus and the dozens of regulars who came there because they knew him. He knew them too. He knew that Mrs. Watson always came in on Tuesdays to buy her husband's favorite tea. He knew that Calvin, the retired mechanic who walked with a cane, needed help reaching the top shelf every time he came in for cereal. And he always made sure that Mrs. James, who sometimes forgot her PIN number, left with her groceries and her dignity intact. That evening, the bell over the door jingled softly as a man entered the store. Marcus glanced up from his register. The man was wrapped in a threadbare jacket, a gray knit beanie pulled low over his ears, and his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He moved slowly, shoulders hunched as if he were bracing against more than just the cold. Marcus had seen that kind of body language before. It was the look of someone carrying a quiet kind of shame, the look of someone who wasn't sure if they belonged. "Evening," Marcus greeted, his tone easy, warm. "Chilly out there tonight. Let me know if you need help finding anything." The man gave a brief nod but said nothing as he stepped further inside, moving through the aisles with cautious hesitation. Marcus noticed how his fingers lingered on price tags, how he picked up items and then set them back down. Eventually, he brought a few things to the counter: a loaf of bread, a small carton of milk, and a protein bar. Just enough to get by. As he fished through his pockets, Marcus could see his hands trembling. He laid out a crumpled $5 bill and a few coins on the counter. It wasn't enough. The man exhaled, his breath catching slightly as he reached for the protein bar. "I'll put this one back," he mumbled. But Marcus shook his head. "Don't worry about it," he said, his voice soft as he rang everything up and slid the bag across the counter. He covered the difference himself without a second thought. We all need a little help now and then. For the first time since he'd walked through the door, the man looked at him. His eyes were dark and intense, filled with something Marcus couldn't quite name: a shock, perhaps, or suspicion. As if he wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with strings attached. After a beat, the man let out a long breath and nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly, as if the words were unfamiliar on his tongue. "You have no idea what this means." Marcus smiled faintly. "Take care. All right?" The man clutched the paper bag close to his chest and stepped out into the night, his silhouette vanishing into the cold. Marcus watched him go but thought nothing more of it. It wasn't the first time he'd helped someone who'd come up short at the register. It wouldn't be the last. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the man he'd just helped wasn't just another customer. He was Jonathan Hale, the billionaire founder and CEO of Hale and Finch Corporation, one of the largest retail chains in the country. And for the first time in years, Jonathan was shaken. The billionaire in disguise. Jonathan Hale sat behind the wheel of a dark sedan parked across the street from Oakwood Market. He hadn't moved in over an hour. The brown paper bag containing bread and milk sat untouched on the passenger seat. He stared out the windshield, his fingers tracing the edge of the receipt. What had just happened? He had walked into Oakwood Market wearing a disguise of sorts: old clothes, no driver, no entourage. He had wanted to see for himself what life was like at the ground level of the business he had spent decades building. Not a scripted visit with cameras and press releases, not an orchestrated walkthrough where employees were warned to smile and managers rehearsed speeches about company culture. But what he found at Oakwood Market had not been what he expected. He had felt vulnerable. And that vulnerability was something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Jonathan exhaled slowly, watching the breath fog up the glass. Marcus Reed. He hadn't even asked his name, but he wouldn't forget his face. There had been no pity in his expression. No condescension, only kindness, quiet, genuine, and uncalculated. For Jonathan, whose world revolved around mergers, acquisitions, and quarterly earnings, that simple gesture had struck something deep. He drove away in silence that night, but he couldn't leave it behind. A closer look. The following evening, Jonathan returned. This time, not by accident. He stood outside the store for a long moment, watching through the windows. Marcus was there again, just as before. He rang up customers with a practiced efficiency, his demeanor calm but warm. He laughed quietly with a woman who struggled to find exact change. He helped an older gentleman balance his groceries while holding his grandson's hand. Jonathan walked through the aisles quietly, watching. He noticed how Marcus took the time to speak with everyone. He wasn't just working. He was seeing people. And then Jonathan saw something that made his stomach turn. A man in a cheap suit with slick-back hair entered the store. He cut straight to the counter, ignoring the line. Jonathan recognized the type immediately: regional management. Men who carried a clipboard and a sense of self-importance. "Evening, Mr. Trask," Marcus said politely. "Reed," the man replied curtly. He dropped a folded piece of paper on the counter. "Payroll's locked. No raises this quarter." Jonathan watched as Marcus's hand tightened briefly on the counter before he nodded. "Understood. You're not going to argue?" Trask smirked. "No, sir." "Smart," Trask said. "Some of your kind don't know when to quit." Jonathan's jaw clenched. Trask turned and walked out like he'd done something magnanimous. Marcus simply folded the paper and tucked it away, then went back to work as if nothing had happened. But Jonathan had seen it. The quiet resignation. The dignity maintained at a cost. And that's when Jonathan Hale made a decision. The turning point. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. He thought about Marcus. About Trask. About the company he had built, and how far it had drifted from what he once believed in. By noon the next day, he was in his corporate office. His executive team gathered around the conference table, their faces blank with expectation. "I want every payroll report from every store," Jonathan said evenly. "Turnover rates. Employee complaints. I want a list of every manager who's denied raises in the last 5 years." There was silence. One executive cleared his throat. "Sir, if this is about—" "It's about fixing what's broken," Jonathan interrupted. "You have 48 hours. After that, I start making changes myself." And he meant it. By evening, Jonathan was back at Oakwood Market. The offer. Marcus was working the register again. When he saw Jonathan enter, he nodded. Recognition. Not surprise. Just a quiet acknowledgement. Jonathan stepped up to the counter. "I figured I owed you a proper introduction," he said. He slid a business card across the counter. Marcus picked it up and stared. "Jonathan Hale, CEO, Hale and Finch Corp." Marcus didn't flinch, but his posture changed, more guarded. "I should have said something sooner," Jonathan continued. "But I needed to see for myself." Marcus said nothing. He just waited. "You deserve that raise," Jonathan said. "And a hell of a lot more." Marcus studied him quietly. "Why?" "Because you represent what this company was supposed to be about," Jonathan said. He pulled out an envelope and laid it next to the card. "It's an offer. Corporate position. Community outreach. You'd help design programs that actually benefit employees like yourself." Marcus was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't do it for a reward." "I know," Jonathan said. "That's why you're the right man for the job." And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan Hale believed in his own company again. Aftermath. In the weeks that followed, Hale and Finch underwent massive changes. Pay raises were approved company-wide. Trask and managers like him were quietly removed. New programs were developed to support frontline employees. And Marcus Reed? He became the voice of those workers. He sat at the table where decisions were made. And he never forgot where he came from. Sometimes, it only takes one act of kindness to change everything.